It was a quiet Tuesday morning in the small town of Crestwood, the kind of morning where the sun barely peeked through the clouds, and the streets were so empty you could hear the rustle of leaves in the wind. But that quiet was about to be shattered. In the middle of the town square, a black SUV screeched to a halt, and out stepped Marcus Johnson, a man whose presence commanded attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that made people stop and stare. But what no one in Crestwood knew, what they couldn't possibly have guessed, was that Marcus wasn't just any man. He was a high-ranking Navy SEAL, a decorated war hero who had spent years in the shadows, serving his country in ways most people could never imagine. And today, his life was about to collide with a system that had already made up its mind about him. It all started with a routine traffic stop. Officer Dan Harris, a white cop with a reputation for being a little too eager to throw his weight around, had been patrolling the area when he spotted Marcus's SUV. To Dan, Marcus was just another black man driving a nice car, a red flag. In his mind, he flipped on his lights and pulled Marcus over, his hand already resting on the butt of his gun. What happened next was a blur. Dan claimed Marcus was aggressive, that he reached for something in his glove compartment, that he had no choice but to draw his weapon. Marcus, on the other hand, insisted he was calm, cooperative, and never posed a threat. But in a town like Crestwood, where the police were rarely questioned, Dan's word was enough to land Marcus in cuffs and, eventually, in court. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial. Word had spread quickly about the case, and the tension in the air was palpable. On one side of the room sat Dan, his uniform pressed and his face set in a mask of righteous indignation. He was confident, almost smug, as he took the stand. He spun a story of fear and danger, painting Marcus as a threat to his life and the safety of the community. The jury listened intently, their faces unreadable. On the other side of the room sat Marcus, calm and composed, his eyes fixed on Dan, as the officer lied through his teeth. But Marcus wasn't just any defendant. He was a man who had faced down terrorists, survived impossible missions, and earned the respect of the most elite warriors in the world. And he wasn't about to let a lying cop destroy his life. As Dan finished his testimony, the prosecutor turned to Marcus and asked if he had anything to say. The room fell silent as Marcus stood, his every movement deliberate and measured. He looked at Dan, then at the jury, and finally at the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, but carrying an edge of steel, "I've spent my life serving this country. I've risked everything to protect the freedoms we hold dear. And today, I stand here accused of a crime I didn't commit by a man who doesn't even know who I am." The room buzzed with whispers, but Marcus wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "This," he said, holding it up, "is my military ID. I am a high-ranking Navy SEAL, and I have the records to prove it. Officer Harris didn't just lie about what happened that day. He lied about who I am." The gasps were audible. Dan's face went pale, and the prosecutor looked like he'd just been handed a live grenade. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied Marcus. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice low and serious. Marcus nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. And I can provide documentation to back it up." The room erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled to get the story. The jury looked stunned, and Dan looked like a man who had just realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. But as the judge called for order, and the bailiff stepped forward to take Marcus's ID, one question hung in the air like a storm cloud. What happens next? How does a small-town cop recover from accusing a Navy SEAL of a crime he didn't commit? And what does this mean for Marcus, a man who has spent his life in the shadows, only to have his identity revealed in the most public way possible? The tension in the room was unbearable, and as the judge banged his gavel and called for a recess, the screen faded to black. The story was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. What would happen when the truth came out? Would justice be served, or would the system protect one of its own? And how would Marcus, a man who had always fought for others, fight for himself in a battle that was about more than just his freedom? It was about his honor, his identity, and the very principles he had sworn to defend. The answers were coming, but for now, all anyone could do was wait and wonder. The recess felt like an eternity. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations, the kind of hushed tones that carried both curiosity and unease. Reporters huddled in the corners, their phones out, frantically typing updates to their editors. The story was too big to ignore. A decorated Navy SEAL, falsely accused by a local cop, and a trial that was unraveling faster than anyone could have predicted. But for Marcus Johnson, the man at the center of it all, the chaos around him was just background noise. He sat quietly at the defense table, his hands folded, his mind racing. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about exposing a system that had failed him, and so many others like him. Marcus had always been a man of few words, a trait honed by years of military discipline, but those who knew him well understood that his silence wasn't a lack of something to say. It was a calculated choice. He had seen too much, done too much, to waste words on things that didn't matter. And right now, what mattered was the truth. As he sat there, he thought back to the day it all began. The day he had driven into Crestwood, a town he barely knew, for what was supposed to be a quick visit to see an old friend. He hadn't expected trouble. He hadn't expected to be pulled over, handcuffed, and thrown into a cell. And he certainly hadn't expected to be sitting in a courtroom fighting for his freedom. Officer Dan Harris, on the other hand, was anything but calm. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he paced the hallway outside the courtroom, his mind racing. He had been so sure of himself when he pulled Marcus over. The man had been driving a black SUV with tinted windows, the kind of car that screamed, suspicious, in Dan's mind. And when Marcus had reached for the glove compartment, Dan had reacted on instinct. Or at least, that's what he told himself. But now, with Marcus's military ID sitting on the judge's bench, Dan's confidence was crumbling. He had lied on the stand, and he knew it. What he didn't know was how far this would go, or how much deeper he was about to sink. As the recess dragged on, the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named Greg Thompson, found himself in a precarious position. He had built his case on Dan's testimony, and now that testimony was falling apart. Greg was no stranger to tough cases, but this one was different. This wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about justice. And as much as he wanted to believe in the system, he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. He had trusted Dan, trusted the evidence, trusted the process. But now, he was starting to wonder if he had trusted the wrong people. Meanwhile, Marcus's defense attorney, a fiery woman named Sarah Collins, was preparing for the fight of her life. Sarah had taken on Marcus's case pro bono, not because she thought it would be easy, but because she believed in him. She had seen the way the system treated people like Marcus, black men who were too often judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. And she was determined to make sure that this time, the system didn't win. As she reviewed her notes, she couldn't help but feel a surge of anger. Marcus was a hero, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country, and yet here he was, fighting for his freedom in a courtroom that seemed determined to see him fail. When the judge finally called the court back into session, the tension in the room was palpable. The bailiff handed Marcus's military ID to the judge, who studied it carefully before turning to Dan. "Officer Harris," the judge said, his voice stern, "is there anything you'd like to add to your testimony?" Dan hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. He knew he was trapped. If he admitted to lying, he could lose his job, or worse. But if he doubled down, he risked perjury charges. It was a no-win situation, and everyone in the room knew it. Marcus watched Dan closely, his expression unreadable. He didn't hate the man. He pitied him. Dan was just a cog in a broken machine, a man who had been taught to see the world in black and white. But Marcus had seen the world in all its shades of gray, and he knew that the truth was rarely simple. As Dan stammered through his response, Marcus felt a pang of sadness. This wasn't just about him and Dan. It was about a system that had failed them both. A system that had turned them into adversaries when they should have been allies. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the day's proceedings. But the trial was far from over. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus found himself surrounded by reporters their cameras flashing, their questions rapid fire, and relentless. He didn't answer them. He didn't need to. His military ID had spoken for him, and now it was up to the court to decide what happened next. But as he walked out of the courthouse, his head held high, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The truth had been set free, and there was no telling where it would lead. Back at the police station, Dan was in full damage control mode. He had called his union rep, his lawyer, anyone who could help him salvage what was left of his career. But deep down, he knew it was too late. The lie had been exposed, and there was no going back. As he sat in his office, staring at the wall, he couldn't help but wonder how it had come to this. He had joined the force to protect and serve, to make a difference. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of that. And now, he was paying the price as night fell over Crestwood. The town was abuzz with speculation. The trial had become the talk of the town, and everyone had an opinion. Some people sided with Dan, convinced that Marcus was just another troublemaker trying to game the system. Others saw Marcus for what he was, a hero who had been wronged. But no matter where they stood, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a reckoning. And as the days passed and the trial continued, the stakes only grew higher. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. But in a town like Crestwood, where secrets ran deep and loyalties ran deeper, the truth was never easy to find. And for Marcus, the fight was just beginning. The next morning, Crestwood woke up to a storm, not just the kind that brewed in the skies, but the kind that stirred in the hearts of its people. The trial had become more than just a local news story. It had sparked a national conversation. News vans lined the streets outside the courthouse, and social media was ablaze with hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #CrestwoodReckoning. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone was watching. But for Marcus, the noise outside the courtroom didn't matter. What mattered was what happened inside those four walls. As he walked into the courthouse, flanked by his attorney Sarah Collins, Marcus could feel the weight of the stares. Some were curious, others hostile, but all of them were intense. He kept his head high, his expression calm, but inside, he was bracing himself for what was to come. Today, the defense would present its case, and Sarah had promised it would be explosive. She had spent the night poring over evidence, digging into Dan's past, and preparing to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece. But even she couldn't predict how far the prosecution would go to protect their own. The first witness Sarah called to the stand was a surprise to everyone, including Marcus. It was a young woman named Emily Carter, a former dispatcher for the Crestwood Police Department. Emily had quit her job 6 months ago, and no one had heard from her since. But Sarah had tracked her down, and now, as Emily took the stand, the room fell silent. She was nervous, her hands trembling as she swore to tell the truth, but there was a fire in her eyes that suggested she wasn't going to hold back. "Miss Carter," Sarah began, her tone gentle but firm, "can you tell the court about your experience working with Officer Dan Harris?" Emily took a deep breath, her gaze flickering to Dan, who was sitting stiffly at the prosecution table. "Dan, Officer Harris, he had a reputation," she said, her voice shaky but clear. "He was always quick to escalate situations, especially with people of color. I heard him say things over the radio, things that made me uncomfortable. And when I tried to report it, I was told to keep my mouth shut." The room erupted into murmurs, and the judge had to call for order. Sarah waited for the noise to die down before continuing. "Did you ever witness Officer Harris falsify reports or lie under oath?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, more than once." The prosecution objected, of course, but the damage was done. Emily's testimony had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the jury, and Sarah wasn't about to let it go. She called witness after witness, former colleagues of Dan's, people who had been on the receiving end of his aggression, even a retired police captain who admitted that the department had a history of turning a blind eye to misconduct. Each testimony chipped away at Dan's credibility, and by the time Sarah was done, the prosecution's case was hanging by a thread. But Greg Thompson wasn't about to go down without a fight. When it was his turn to cross-examine, he went on the offensive, trying to discredit the witnesses and paint Marcus as a threat. He brought up Marcus's military training, suggesting that it made him dangerous, and even tried to imply that Marcus had something to hide. But Marcus didn't flinch. He sat quietly, his expression unreadable, as Greg's accusations bounced off him like bullets off armor. He had faced worse than this, much worse, and he wasn't about to let a desperate prosecutor rattle him. As the day wore on, the tension in the courtroom grew thicker. The jury looked exhausted. The judge was growing impatient, and even the reporters seemed to be running out of steam. But just when it seemed like the trial couldn't get any more intense, Sarah dropped a bombshell. "Your Honor," she said, standing to address the judge, "we have one more witness we'd like to call. This witness has critical information that directly contradicts Officer Harris's testimony." The judge raised an eyebrow but nodded, and Sarah turned to the bailiff. "The defense calls Dr. Rachel Nguyen." The name meant nothing to most people in the room, but Marcus recognized it immediately. Dr. Nguyen was a forensic expert who had worked on some of the most high-profile cases in the country. She was also the person Sarah had hired to analyze the dashcam footage from Dan's patrol car, footage that the prosecution had conveniently lost before the trial. As Dr. Nguyen took the stand, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. If anyone could uncover the truth, it was her. Doctor Nguyen was calm and composed as she explained her findings. Using advanced software, she had been able to recover the deleted footage, and what it showed was damning. The video clearly contradicted Dan's version of events. Marcus hadn't been aggressive. He hadn't reached for anything in his glove compartment. He hadn't done anything to justify Dan pulling his weapon. In fact, the footage showed Marcus calmly complying with Dan's instructions, his hands visible at all times. The room was silent as Dr. Nguyen finished her testimony, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. The prosecution was quick to object, of course, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the footage, and there was no one seeing it. As the judge called for a recess, Marcus felt a surge of relief. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt like he might actually win. But as he walked out of the courtroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. Dan wasn't going to give up without a fight, and neither was the system that had protected him for so long. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown even larger. Protesters held signs demanding justice, while counter-protesters shouted them down. The air was thick with tension, and Marcus could feel it pressing down on him as he made his way to Sarah's car. He didn't say much as they drove away, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. The trial wasn't over yet, and neither was the battle. But for the first time, Marcus allowed himself to hope. Hope that the truth would prevail. Hope that justice would be served. And hope that, when this was all over, he could finally move on with his life. But as the sun set over Crestwood, casting long shadows over the town, one question remained unanswered. What would happen when the system was forced to confront its own flaws? And what would it cost Marcus to finally get the justice he deserved? The answers were still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And as the trial continued, the stakes only grew higher. The truth was close, so close, but in a town like Crestwood, the truth was never easy to find. And for Marcus, the fight was far from over.